Hi, I'm Dr. Jackson Crawford. I'm a specialist in Old Norse language and literature. And on my YouTube channel dedicated to these topics, I try to be responsive to questions that the public has about those topics. There is an interesting connection between Viking history and the history of Russia and Ukraine. And to speak much more authoritatively on the subject than I can, I have brought on my distinguished friend and colleague, Dr. Vicki Grove, who is a teaching professor in the Department of Germanic and Slavic Languages and Literatures, actually in both the Slavic and Nordic divisions of that department at the University of Colorado Boulder, to talk to us a little bit about, well, the Viking connection to the early history of Ukraine and Russia, uh, who the Rus are, what Kyivan Rus means, and how some of this history and lore is being used in our present day conflicts. This is not a current events channel, so we're not really getting into news on the ground or anything like that, but rather seeking to inform people outside of a Ukrainian or Russian speaking milieu about how some of that medieval history and lore is being used in that part of the world today. So Vicky, take it away. Tell us a little bit about who the Rus were, what Kievan Rus is, what is this story from the Middle Ages, and how is this being used today?
Okay, so thank you, Jackson, and thank you for inviting me to speak here. So there's really just one story, I would say, and most of what is known about the early Russian state, Kievan Rus, comes from Russia's earliest written record called the Primary Chronicle, or the Tale of Bygone Years, and it actually dates the origins of the area back to the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, who divided the earth after the flood. In Russia, the Varangians, the Swedes, the Normans, and the Rus, among others, number among the races of Japheth. So it goes that far back. And then it proceeds to tell the story of the founding of Kyiv by three brothers who call themselves Polonians. There's Ki, Shek, and Koriv, and they found a city which they call Kiev. But of most interest, and really the next main story that the chronicle tells, is the account of the founding of what became known as Kievan Rus. So according to the chronicle, in the mid-9th century, the Varangians from beyond the seas imposed tribute upon the Slavs, and even who the Slavs were remains a bit of a question. It's generally considered that the word comes from the word slova, which in Russian means word. They were people who shared a common word, common language, and other tribes. So the Varangians imposed tribute upon them. Eventually, these tribes grew resentful and refused to pay tribute, drove the Varangians back across the sea. But within a couple of years, they realized that they were incapable of ruling themselves, and they were at war with one another. And so finally in 862, they approached the Varangian Rus and invited them to come and restore order and rule over them. So that was Rurik, right? Or Roriker. Along with his two brothers, Rurik settled in Novgorod, and then his descendants moved to Kiev and established a political center there. And this also established the first ruling dynasty, the Rurik dynasty, which is the only dynasty other than the Romanovs, which begins in the 17th century. So did you want to comment on what the meaning of the word Rus is? I've heard various things, but I think you can speak better to it than I can.
Well, I think there's a few words here that could bear a little bit of attention. One of them is Varangian, right? So in Old Norse, we see a term Varingjar, right, which actually occurs on quite a few different contexts. It's found on some rune stones from the Viking Age. We find it in Old Norse literature, including in the Poetic Edda, where it sometimes seems to be almost a synonym for Scandinavians. And then, of course, we see it in the name of the Varangian Guard, the
Right.
Scandinavian bodyguards to the emperor in Byzantium, Constantinople, which is even further south from what we're talking about.
Right.
Probably it, it can be analyzed fairly simply in Old Norse. Varangi would be people who have pledged an oath. The var is related to German va, right, like true, and to English warlock, right, the person who has also pledged an oath. So presumably it's a term that has its origin as something like people have made some kind of pledge to one another, perhaps as members of a Viking crew or an army or something like that. Rus is an interesting one to me. So I believe that in Russian, Russia is Russia, right?
Oh,
Something along those
yes.
lines. So spelled with an O vowel. But of
Mhm.
course, this medieval groups usually referred to as the Rus, right, with a U
Right.
vowel. But in Old Norse, probably what this comes from is Roths, with a later loss of one of those consonants to give us Ros, meaning just like a rower,
Okay.
right? So you would say like a Rosman, the oarsman, essentially. There is a part of eastern Sweden called to this day Ruslagen, which is something like where the laws of the rowers apply. And it's interesting to note that the name in Finnish for Sweden to this day is Ruotsi, which probably comes from that very same word too. So presumably what's happening is that this is a term being used by Swedish Vikings in Eastern Europe um, for themselves as a profession, right? They're the oarsmen, but that this over time comes to be more of an ethnic designation for Scandinavians in Eastern Europe.
Right.
I've heard some other alternative theories, but that seems pretty straight up to me. It makes sense in terms of certainly the origin of the Finnish word, and I would think of the Slavic too.
Right. Well, and that's consistent with the Chronicle, where Rus is reserved to describe the Scandinavians specifically, and then the Varangians describes the people who serve in the prince's retinue, which wasn't just Scandinavians, but also Slavs.
Well, that would make sense too, with the basic meaning of the pledged people or something like that.
Right.
And I think, isn't there a Byzantine chronicle? I was trying to track down exactly what this was, where the river routes from Eastern Europe to Constantinople are discussed, and some of the landmarks along the way are given their names in quote Slavic and then quote Russian, right? The language of the Rus. And the Rus language there is Norse, right? So at least in around 1000, Rus meant Scandinavian rather than Slavic
Right.
to a Greek-speaking Byzantine.
Right. So continuing with the story, and this is a great connection to Scandinavian history, but among the Varangians who joined Rurik were two men, one named Höskuldr and one named Tyr. And according to the story, Höskuldr is the son of Bjorn Ironside, the grandson of Ragnar Lothbrok.
Wow.
And they asked permission of Rurik to travel to Constantinople, but only made it as far as Kiev, where they settled with their own families and then gathered a retinue of other Varangians and proceeded to impose rule upon those people concurrently with Rurik ruling in Novgorod, and then eventually Rurik's descendants moved down to Kiev. But I like that little bit of detailed information, which is such a clear link, right?
And can I ask, I'm interested, you look at a map and, you can throw these place names out there and, it all sounds like kind of vaguely Eastern Europe. You actually look at a map, Novgorod to Q, actually, maybe we need to talk about the name of the city, to Constantinople, these are huge distances.
Yes, yeah.
Right. So we're talking about a very far flung society and one that's not close. I mean, maybe kind of in Novgorod, but for the most part, not very close to Scandinavia at all.
Mhm.
What is the original significance of the location that becomes the city of Kyiv. Why is that on the river Dnieper such a key location?
Well, so it has, and here's where I should check a map too, but it's, so Kiev, there's so many waterways, right? And so that greatly facilitated trade, right, between Scandinavia and Byzantium. But the rivers not only run north to south, like the Dnieper runs right through the middle of Kiev, right? It divides the city pretty much. Similarly, there's a river, the Volga, that divides Novgorod. But in any case, there are also east and west running rivers, and I can't think, but Kiev is like just perfectly located for trade, for international trade, and that contributes just to the vastly like multi-ethnic quality of the city, and you see that in so many ways. Like, even I'll be talking here in a moment about the significance of Prince Vladimir, but well, he adopts Eastern Orthodox Christianity for his people, but before he does that, he adopts a formalized form of paganism. And the gods that he selects as part of that pantheon come from all over the place. And so, and it just speaks to just the varying disparate backgrounds of the people who lived in Kiev. So it was very much on a cultural crossroads, and I'm sure it has to do with the geography of it, with just the locations, the ease of access, I guess, by waterways. Yeah, because they are huge distances, but much easier to travel by boat, which is generally how they got around. They were the roads that run, is what they were called. Yeah, so so it prospered, it grew as a city, and it becomes, right, so that becomes the political center, not just the political center, but as we'll see, the the center for culture and Christianity and education and that as well. So let me see. So I will just pause here for a moment, just referring back to that story of Rurik being invited to rule over the Slavs. So for reasons that probably go without saying, that there's some hesitation on the part of Russian and especially Soviet historians to accept that version of events. Part of it is simply national pride, right? That the Slavs realized they could not order themselves or rule over themselves, and so they invited their former oppressors to do it. And that in itself just seems maybe a little bit unlikely, that a subjugated people would turn to their oppressors and invite them to rule over them again. But matters of national pride aside, the other thing is that the primary chronicle, it covers the events from about like 852 to about 1115, something like that. But that's when it was written. And so it's describing events that took place, 300 years almost before they were recorded. And so its essential reliability, I think, is somewhat questionable. You mentioned the Byzantine Chronicle. That was a source. There was like a Novgorodian Chronicle that was a source. There were some oral traditions that were sources. And generally the writing of it is attributed to a monk named Nestor, who lived in the Caves Monastery in Kiev. But it's generally actually accepted now that it was written by several different authors. And one question, I guess, is simply, how accurate it might be when there were so many opportunities to like reconstruct events or change events or censor events by individual writers who maybe had their own agenda or to satisfy somebody else's agenda. I mean, for example, it may be that the story is told that way to legitimize the fact that the Ruriks are in power. Like, you asked us to come and rule over you, right? So just and there's no way really to know. I mean, there's so little, I don't really know, except for archaeological evidence, and archaeology, of course, attests to the fact that the Scandinavian peoples were there, right? The question is just, what was the role? And some want to take the middle ground and say, well, probably they worked together, right, to establish the state. but I think of Kievan Rus. But I think also just looking at the names of the first princes of Kiev is also very telling. So Rurik's descendants include, and of course in the chronicle, the name is like Rusvide. So there's Oleg, who was Helgi, Igor, who was Ingvar, Olga, who was Helga. I mean, you have clearly Scandinavian names of the princes until finally you get to Sviatoslav, right? The son of Olga and Igor, who was the first to have a Slavic name. And then he's, his son Vladimir succeeds him. So that's kind of telling to me, right? That the first rulers were, at least named, had Scandinavian names. Certainly they eventually like acculturated, just, kind of, what's the word, dispersed, into the Slavic culture. But the names I always find very interesting.
And that seems conscious if it's being maintained for that many generations in a mostly Slavic speaking milieu.
Yeah.
Right. Some kind of conscious attempt to reinforce a somewhat different cultural identity against the people who are being ruled.
Right. So let me see. So moving on again to Vladimir, and I think like Scandinavia adopted Christianity around the same time that Vladimir did, but they
from
did
a different direction.
I was going to say, I was pretty sure that had to be the case, right? So Vladimir, and again, this story is accounted, it's more of a legend almost in the primary chronicle, that Vladimir explored every, he abandoned his plan for a pagan system when he was realizing that, all of his peers had adopted monotheistic faith. So he abandoned after a few years his paganism. But he explored every form of monotheistic faith and then just made a decision based on, well, a number of reasons, but the primary reason that he chose Eastern Orthodox Christianity was because he had sent emissaries to visit the Hagia Sophia Cathedral there in Constantinople, and they came back and just were overwhelmed by what they had seen there. And so it was a choice that did not necessarily come from any profound experience of personal faith, but it was a pretty practical decision. Plus at the time, Byzantium was a hugely powerful empire. So he adopts Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and it impacts, art and architecture and education, right? It's just the lives of the people, even the law codes there too. You might consider the law codes where it was Yaroslav the Wise, a son of Vladimir, who codifies Russian laws, but they still have laws that look very Scandinavian, like blood prices. Like you if somebody kills your brother, then you kill him, right? True. Or you can pay like a vergeld kind of thing. But after the adoption of Christianity, they moved to a process of just fining people, right, for different crimes. And my students are always amazed to learn that the fine for cutting off a man's finger was less than harming his beard. But in it, you learn a lot about the values of a culture by studying their law code.
Certain symbolic value to the beard, maybe.
I'm certain, yes, no doubt.
I think it's interesting to know too. I don't have a perfect command of any Slavic language, but just listening to these names that you mentioned, I hear, parallels to Norse names, right? So Volodymyr, Vladimir, something like great power, something along those lines.
Right, yeah.
And Sviatoslav, Slav is glory, right? And
right.
So martial sounding names.
Oh.
Is that, would you say that's true of this culture?
I would say that is true, yes. And it's not always that way, but yeah, at least among these first ones, yeah. So that's interesting too. I hadn't really given a lot of thought to that. But then we also had these very colorful, attributive names, like there's a lot of warfare between rivalries between princes in Kievan Rus, and one of Yaroslav the Wise's brothers is murdered two of their other brothers to try to claim the throne for himself, and he became known as Svatopolk, the Damned. And there are lots of other fun names like that. But
and you mentioned the word prince. Is the word prince in the primary chronicle, is that knyaz?
Knyaz, yes. Yeah.
Which is a borrowing from some early Germanic language, maybe not Old Norse or the Viking is probably an earlier stage even, but from the same word that ultimately becomes English, king. Right.
And something that like my students sometimes have a hard time grasping, even like you read a work by Tolstoy, there are princes and princes all over the place, right? And at least Americans' familiarity is mostly with, royal families, like Britain, and that, but basically anybody who could trace their lineage back to the founding family, right, could claim the title. It didn't necessarily come with wealth or privilege.
I see.
But it is, that was basically what Kievan Rus looked like. It was a bunch of principalities. It was never an organized, highly structured political or governmental system. It was a bunch of principalities. And that's problematic for a lot of reasons. It leads to civil warfare. Vladimir also was involved in the deaths of a couple of his brothers to claim the throne at Kiev. There's a lot of just civil warfare, plus there are foreign nomadic tribes invading, right? So all of Kievan Rus is pretty unstable in a lot of ways, partly because there was no law of succession. Ironically, Russia does not have, I'm speaking of Russia now, but Russia will not have a law of succession until 1796.
Wow,
a long
many
time
centuries
before they have a law. It's always by tradition, but there's a brief period during the rule of Yaroslav the Wise, who he tried to create a rotatorship, because basically, princes had their territories, they had their druzhini, the retinues, their retinues who, that would help enforce their boundaries and protect it and whatnot. But they acknowledged that Kiev was the center of power, and the Prince of Kiev was the most powerful, and he received tribute from their other principalities. Everybody wanted to be Prince of Kiev, and so they would just fight with each other. It would just come down to warfare because there was no system. And this, ultimately it's pretty devastating, because when the Mongol invasion happens, by the time the Mongol army gets to Kiev in 1240, it is so inherently unstable that they have no problem taking it over. There's no way to organize an army against them, right? And that's almost like the end of Ukrainian history for a while. But I wanted also just to kind of summarize some things here. So it's important, I think, for us, given the current situation, to understand the importance of Kievan Rus and why arguments over who has claim to its legacy is so important and relevant, because there's so many factors that contribute to shaping Slavic and Russian identity that come out of this period, right? It's granted it's a very loose political structure, but the prince at Kiev eventually becomes the Grand Prince. During the Mongol occupation, the title of Grand Prince, it goes to Vladimir, but ends up in Moscow. Eventually, the Grand Prince takes the title of Tsar, right? Eastern Orthodox Christianity, as the official form of worship, impacts every aspect of life, at least through the time of Peter the Great. The adoption, or the creation, I should say, of a Cyrillic alphabet, right, for the spoken language. All of these things originate from this time. All of those things that later, of course, are so important as well to Russia's national identity emerge from this time.
And the primary chronicle is would you call the language that it's in Old East Slavic? Or...
I have not looked at it in the original language. It would have been like an Old Church Slavonic, which I like to show my students, even the alphabet that Cyril, it was two monks, I should say, Cyril and Methodius developed that alphabet based on the Greek. So it's like if you can read the Greek alphabet, you can fumble your way through a lot of Cyrillic characters. But that was actually the glagolitic alphabet. It's totally unrecognizable. And even Church Slavonic, it's a very difficult alphabet. I can read words on icons largely because I know what they should say. It's like, oh yeah,
Sure.
I can see that. But it's actually, it becomes almost an obstacle to education. And so it's Peter the Great who does so much, but he modernizes the alphabet in part to better facilitate education. So the Cyrillic alphabet that we know now looks very different from what was originally developed, and that was because of Peter the Great. But even in the 20th century, there were a couple of superfluous characters that were dropped.
I've noticed that. I took Old Church Slavic in grad school, as a matter of fact.
Of course you did.
But looking at Russian, from the 18th century, even, it does not look like Russian printed today.
Oh,
so there have been quite a few reforms there. But would the language in the East, so the contemporary East Slavic languages would be Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, right? At this time, would those still be more or less one language, or do you think is there not enough to say?
Yeah. So it seems that the Mongol invasion is in part what led to the separation of many different groups that then went on to develop different, like the different Slavic languages.
I see.
There are so many, but that's, and I may be wrong, but that's my understanding. I'm not a linguist myself, but that was kind of a line of demarcation, kind of that led to like Galicia, Volhynia, anyway, and Belarus, and anyway, so developing variations. Like Ukrainian isn't so different from Russian, but that it seems to have been after that point. So I don't know that there's enough information to say that everybody was speaking this, a common Slavic tongue at that point. But
okay. And so bringing that back, you mentioned the Mongol invasion. Bringing it back to your historical story, then, is it the Mongol invasion then that shifts the center of power in the East Slavic world northeast out of Kyiv to Moscow, St. Petersburg? Is that the emphasis?
Yeah, so yes. And actually, even before that event, Kiev was losing its significance. There were other trade routes that had been developed. It wasn't as important as it had been. I mean, now we're looking at the 13th century, right? The Mongol invasion, which begins 1237. So already, like one of the princes, was it Andre? I don't remember. Actually transferred the title of Grand Prince to a town called Vladimir, and Moscow was a very, very small, town. In its earliest history, it was just like this fortified outpost that gradually grows during the course of the Mongol occupation, where it's now the Mongol Khan who confers power, that like the title of Grand Prince, to whomever they are most pleased with. And so there is some competition between, there's Vladimir, there's Suzdal, there's Moscow. Eventually, though, Moscow claims the title of Grand Prince for itself. It's Ivan the First. There are many Ivans in Russia's history, and anyway, so they stay in good favor with the Khan. They keep the title. They're allowed to collect taxes. They gradually, Moscow grows. It acquires more property, more people, more wealth. Eventually, one of the princes of Moscow, Dmitry Donskoy, stands up. It's like the first Russian army to defeat a Mongol army. That's not till 1380, so that's a long time after the initial invasion. And then finally, it's the third Ivan, Ivan the Great, who just refuses to acknowledge Mongol authority any longer, refuses to pay them any more tribute. and that's just kind of the end. But even, like there was, at this point, like they're, I guess, more accurately referred to as Tartars, but they themselves were having their own internal struggles, and they, eventually just agreed to leave Moscow alone. But they retained some khanates, like Crimea, the Crimean Khanate, right, which was also recently introduced, was not acquired by Russia until 1783 under Catherine the Great. Yeah, so getting back to Ukraine then, yeah, it's within 100 years, that territory, that, a good part of what had been Kievan Rus falls under the rule of Polish Lithuania. And for about 400 years, like I said, it's not, it's outside of Russia's borders, but it still has, people that are Eastern Orthodox, and they're, it's considered like a time of like social and religious oppression. And then again, under Catherine the Great, through the partitioning of Poland that happens at the end of the 18th century, they get those territories back, right? So now so from that time, Ukraine once again becomes, or sorry, I mean, it's not like it's once again, it now falls within the borders of Russia, and under Russian authority, where it will stay. And in the around 1900, early 1900s, there was a national movement where it was a Ukrainian historian named Khrushchevsky who made the argument that Kievan Rus was an entirely Ukrainian state, and that Russia and the Russians only emerged later from the forests. It's kind of interesting, but it wasn't, I mean, there were some other attempts for independence, but it's not until December of 1991 that Ukraine finally becomes, an independent state, when all the republics are gradually seceding from the former Soviet Union, and then it joins the Commonwealth of Independent States with Belarus and Russia and the Transcaucasus until the annexation of Crimea, which had been part of Ukraine since 1954, but after that it left the CIS and became independent.
And how old is the designation Ukraine for the region anchored around, I suppose, the city of Kyiv? And I've heard, and I'm interested in your input on this, that Ukraine is an old word for something like borderland or frontier. Is that right?
That's what I've heard too, and I wish I was more of a linguist authority on this, but that's what I've heard. And as far as I'm trying to think of how back references to it go, I would have to look, because I'm not sure.
Okay. And while we're talking about names, so let's see if we can clear up any of the confusion around the name of the city, because for a very long time it's been referred to in English as Kiev.
Yeah.
Right? Which most English speakers say Kiev. I believe in Russian that's like Kiev.
Yeah, but you get the F, right? You get the Kiev, right? It's very clear.
Yeah, Kiev.
Right.
That final devoicing. And then recently, especially in the last decade, there's been more favor in the English-speaking world for the Ukrainian spelling, Kyiv, which I believe in Ukrainian is pronounced more like Q. Is that about right?
Yes, and that's been on the news lately, because suddenly you're hearing it pronounced Kiev, right?
Right, because everybody's been saying Kyiv or something.
Yeah, and Kiev, and that's just what you're used to. But yes, that's how Ukrainians pronounce it, right? And so it's a nod to them, because it's the Russians who pronounce it Kiev, but pronunciations like Moscow it's Moskva, right?
Right. Yeah. It's all Copenhagen versus, Kievan or really, right. Yeah.
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 So
It's
anyway, this show is just being respectful of the Ukrainian
sure.
pronunciation, particularly given just the current climate
Mhm.
of everything.
But it occurs to me, there's a lot of, it seems like the language barrier or language border is kind of porous here. There seems to be a lot of Russian in Ukraine. I've heard that Kiev is majority Russian speaking, and in fact, I believe President Zelensky's native language is Russian,
Mm.
though he's from Ukraine. So there seems that language border seems not to reflect the political border.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And of course, the recent regions of Ukraine that have been recognized as like individual republics, they do have a large Russian population, but they have had historically, right, Russians and Ukrainians and Jewish people and other people there as well. So I mean, but one can't. I mean that. So Russia has had a long history of justifying certain actions as being undertaken to protect the interests of Russian-speaking people or Eastern Orthodox people in certain regions, right? So some of the like expansion in the Caucasus, for example, into the Crimea in the 19th century was to protect, Russian peoples living there. But the area that became Ukraine, right, has always been so multinational. I mean, you can hardly make an argument that, and I'm not saying that is the argument, right? That because there are so many Russian speaking people and people maybe who identify as Russian in Ukraine, I mean, that is not a reason to take over Ukraine,
right,
and bring it back. Fold.
And actually, that raises another question, sort of ancillary to the language question. So there's a deep history of Eastern Orthodox religion among Eastern Slavic speaking people, but you also mentioned that Ukraine had been under Poland, Lithuania for a long time. Is there a large Catholic presence in Ukraine?
Well, no, and in fact, they created what was called the Uniate Church for Eastern Orthodox Ukrainians, where like they acknowledged the authority of the Pope, but they were allowed to continue to practice. It's really interesting. I'm only aware of it happening in that, in that one region. So they continued, to identify as Eastern Orthodox, but it was like some compromise. So I don't know all the details of that. I just know that it was addressed and that's how it was dealt with. So they were still Eastern Orthodox, but somehow they acknowledged the Pope as opposed to the patriarch.
Sounds complicated.
I know.
But all of this is complicated.
I know. I mean, yeah.
This is what you're really painting for me is a very complicated history, with a lot of different influences coming from a lot of different regions. So today, this history and lore are getting used, I noticed, somewhat aggressively in speeches by Putin himself.
Yeah.
Would you comment on that some? What is Putin's understanding of this, and how is it informing his moves as far as we can tell?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't be so bold as to say that I understand anything that Putin is doing, but I can still provide some context. So first of all, like in the post-Soviet periods, independent Ukraine has made many intentional efforts to reclaim their legacy of Kievan Rus. And so, for example, they adopted the trident into their what do you call it,
Coat of arms.
Coat of arms. Thank you. Yes, the trident, right? And that was the symbol of the Ukrainian princes, and what else? Yeah, just restoring those ancient monasteries and cathedrals. And honestly, I mean, the human cost is so huge in war, but I've been to those places, right? I've been to the Caves Monastery, and I hope they remain intact. But also, like, they erected a statue of Princess Olga, right? Who was, it's always so ironic to me, the first Christian princess, but oh my goodness, the stories about her right before she adopted Christianity for herself. She was the grandmother of Vladimir, but she adopted Christianity just personally for herself. They built a statue of her in downtown Kiev, right? So they're kind of laying claim to this history. But then in 2016, Putin unveiled a statue of Vladimir, this great, Kievan prince, right outside the Kremlin wall. The thing is just absolutely massive. It's just huge. In the mid 19th century, Kiev had constructed a statue of Prince Vladimir overlooking the Dnieper River, where the people were baptized, and that made sense. But this was really such a political statement,
Sure.
and I think it's like maybe right there lies the crux of like the current conflict regarding the legacy of Kievan Rus. And so like Moscow and Putin see Vladimir as a unifier and founder of an all Rus state. Mm-hmm. But Ukraine considers him the father of the Ukrainian state alone, and that they have a history and a future apart from Russia. So they both claim that legacy. And I don't know that I can even say who's right. I think they're both right in a way, just because, like I said, so much of Russia's identity goes back to Kievan Rus, right? The church, right, and art and culture and everything associated with that. Eastern Orthodoxy has also been like key, kind of fundamental to the popular image of the Tsar, even. The alphabet, the language, the Tsar, originating in the figure of the Grand Prince. So I can kind of see that, but at the same time, geographically and historically, Ukraine has deep roots in Kievan Rus. I don't know that Ukraine can unequivocally claim for itself the entirety of that legacy, but that doesn't, at all preclude its right to be an independent state. But I think they both, right? They both have a claim to that legacy, and why can't we all just get along? But it's Putin's been using it to justify, like, I don't know, do I call it reclaiming Ukraine? Because they're all part of the same, state that has its origins in Kievan Rus. So I mean, it kind of makes sense to me, but I can't ever agree with what's going on.
A couple thoughts I had about this. Well, one is, you've mentioned the central figure of this Prince Vladimir, and I note that the presidents of both countries are named Vladimir. So, and actually it shows a little bit of the difference between Ukrainian and Russian. I noticed that in Ukrainian news, Vladimir Putin, his name is given as Volodymyr Putin, right? So that there's a clear awareness this is the exact same name, right? And it's interesting that although surely not consciously, both of them are ultimately named for the ruler of this polity that's 1,000 years in the past,
right?
That both states make some claim to the heritage of. And I guess the associated thought that I get with that is it's a little bit like in the United States, we grew up with older English literature as part of our heritage, right? So we read some Shakespeare in school, even writers from after American independence, Dickens, Tennyson, Kipling are often read as part of just, literature in high school or college.
Right.
And it seems to me that it's a little bit like that kind of shared past where you have two clearly separate polities, right? There's no justification for the UK invading the US invading the UK, but you could imagine a world in which some deranged leader in one country or the other said, well, they're really just part of us because look at all of this past that we share, in spite
Right.
of this complex series of splits and reapproaches that we've had over time.
Yeah.
Would you say that that's a little bit parallel, obviously with a lot less blood spilled?
A little bit. I mean, I always find it funny when I hear, someone in London referring to us as the colonies.
Yeah, right.
Across I know, and it's a reminder. So of course, we do have that heritage, but yeah, less bloody. I mean, I think that's a fair it's a fair comparison.
Yeah, that's when I always decide to be the guy who says, "Hey, buddy, how about World War II? Where would you be? Where would you be now?" But,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
it, obviously, there's not the same kind of. There's never been an attempted violent takeover by the U.S. of the U.K., right? So none of that
No,
heritage has been used in the same way. I'm so obsessed with metaphors and analogies and such, and trying to present stuff and help people understand, and that's just something that comes to mind.
yeah.
Or, a somewhat more niche comparison might be Denmark, Norway, Sweden, where there's a lot of shared history,
Right.
heritage, even literature, but there's so many different historical forces have led them apart, then back together, and apart, and then back together in different ways. Less violently than it seems in Eastern Europe. And you're a fluent speaker of Russian. What is your take on the mutual intelligibility and general sense of difference between Ukrainian and Russian?
So having visited Ukraine when I was in Russia the first time, I found I could understand it. It's I can't speak to. I mean, I could give you an example of a word like morozhino, which is ice cream, is morozovo in Ukrainian. So very, very similar. And and maybe, so I'll make an analogy here and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but so I've been studying Norwegian independently for a couple of years now, and I find I can understand Swedish, at least a lot of Swedish. And I was kind of interested in realizing I could even read some Old Norse. So very little of it, but maybe it's something like that, where if you have familiarity with one language, you can at least make sense of the other, but maybe that's not a good comparison. But they're similar enough, but but also they're their own, right? Distinctive.
I've been listening to a fair amount of both lately, and one thing that I really stuck out to me was it seems like Ukrainian has less reduction of vowels and unstressed syllables, right? So that, for example, it sounded to me like, so what in Russian is like Russia was in Ukrainian more like Russia, right? So the vowel is less reduced, and that seems to be a common pattern through Ukrainian. Which I wonder if that actually means that Ukrainians would have an easier time understanding Russian than vice versa, but I don't know.
Oh, maybe so. But you have the ear for those kinds of linguistic nuances. But I think
it's an obsession of mine.
You're onto something, and you might be right. Yeah, that it's easier for Ukrainians to understand Russian than vice versa.
Well, Vicki, thank you very much for taking the time here today. Would you like to make any closing remarks?
Boy, I don't want to, date this specifically, but I mean,
it's going to be a little bit dated.
Yeah, I guess it will have to be. But yeah, I'm very dismayed by the situation, obviously, and I can't tell how it's going to end. But I appreciate having the opportunity to at least speak on behalf. That's too grand of a thing to say, to at least enlighten listeners about some of the history of Ukraine, and hopefully clarify a little bit of where some of the conflict comes from. I can't explain the war, but at least that Putin's assertions that that they have this shared history, I hope is understandable now, even if you don't agree with his actions, grounded in that assertion.
Well, you've helped me appreciate this much better than any other English language source I've come across. So thank you very much for that.
I did my best. It's a lot to try to process and convey, but I appreciate that. So
No, you've done a great job with this. Thank you so much. And to everyone else out there from beautiful Colorado, all the best. And Slava Ukraini.